Hello everybody, and welcome back. Today we're diving into a faction that truly understands how frankly terrifying the universe they live in actually is. So today we're talking about what personally I believe is a poster boy for the Warhammer 40k universe, the very backbone of humanity's grimdark armies, the glorious Astra Militarum, also known as the Imperial Guard. Now when you think of humanity's defenders in 40k, oftentimes you'll go to Space Marines, the Adeptus Astartes. They're these massive genetically engineered super soldiers in power armor who act as vainglorious knights. But here's the thing, the people often miss. They're not the ones fighting day to day for humanity's survival. That job falls onto the Imperial Guard, which is the largest coherent fighting force in the entire galaxy. And when I say the largest, I mean the scale that the human brain genuinely starts struggling to comprehend in numbers is that of the Astra Militarum. Stepping out into a universe filled with literal demons, hyper-advanced alien empires, biological swarms that are designed to literally consume your entire planet. And you aren't a genetically enhanced demigod. You don't have godlike armor. You're just a regular person handed a lasgun and a uniform. Which, ironically enough, the lasgun is often referred to as a flashlight, despite it being able to burn through an A1 Abrams tank in a single shot. This is the eerie, almost hopelessness that the Astra Militarum is steeped in. However, you're not alone. The amount of guys fighting alongside you is just so unbelievably ungodly massive that the Imperium's own record keepers, the Departamento Munitorum, literally cannot put an accurate number of how many soldiers are currently serving with you. The statistics we do have of the numbers they've managed to keep track of, which is supposed to be a fraction of a fraction of a fraction, is every single year there's trillions of new recruits tithed into the Imperial Guard every single day. And casualty reports alongside the new active duty recruit list will often number in the millions for any one battlefield. It is said that if you took the entirety of the Imperial Guard and lined them up in a singular column, that the line of humanity would stretch all the way from Terra to Armageddon. You are taking trillions of guardsmen and then dividing them into millions of regiments, which means at that point losing a few million here or there isn't just a tragedy, it's more of a rounding error. You have so much to keep track of that a singular soldier is literally a drop of blood in the middle of an ocean. Men, we are the first, last, and often only line of defense the Imperium has against what is out there. You and that fine piece of Imperial weaponry that you hold in your hands is all that's keeping humanity alive. Most of you will probably not live to see your second year in the Guard, and most of you will probably never see your homeworlds again. But I can guarantee you that when you do fall, with a prayer to the Most High and Mighty God Emperor on your lips, you will have earned the right to call yourself a man. This is a quote from Staff Sergeant Verkman of the 12th Cadian Shock Regiment, which explains how exactly the Imperial Guard sees their ability to produce mass numbers as their truly only defense against the dark, attempting to snuff out what little light humanity produces. Now it is because of this nigh infinite manpower that the primary tactic of the Imperial Guard isn't exactly elegant. If the Space Marines are the scalpel of the Emperor, specializing in precise planetary assaults and decapitation strikes against enemy leaders, the Astra Militarum is truly the hammer of the Emperor. They win through absolute grinding attrition. They overwhelm the enemy with an endless influx of bodies, charging forward under the cover of mass artillery barrages and delivering massed volleys of synchronized lasgun fire, as they are able to crush whatever and whomever is in front of them beneath the treads of millions upon millions of heavy battle tanks. While an individual human soldier might seem lost and forgotten in the chaos, the collective actions of these anonymous men and women decides the fate of entire worlds every single day. And when things truly get desperate, they will call in the absolute elite, the famed stormtroopers, the Kazarkin, or even the Death Corps Grenadiers. There is no true universal uniform in these forces, as many of these regiments are often just equipped with what their planet can issue out alongside the standard issue armaments. However, many worlds attempt to copy the more standardized gear of the Cadian shock troopers, who are widely considered the gold standard for infantry. The only constant across every regiment is the presence of a commissar somewhere amongst their ranks. Officers placed within the group in order to maintain brutal discipline, keep up morale, and watch for any signs of heretical taint or corruption. But how did we get here? To understand the massive meat grinder, which is the Astra Militarum, we have to go back to the early 31st millennium, during a period known as the Great Crusade. Back then, the Emperor of Mankind was actively conquering the stars, as humanity is destined to do, by birthright, using the Space Marine legions as a forefront of the spear. But as incredible as the Space Marines are, even back then their numbers were finite. And as the Imperium grew, the legions were spread thinner and thinner across thousands and thousands upon thousands of light years. The Emperor, in his infinite wisdom, comprehended he needed bodies in order to hold the conquered territory and keep the momentum going. So the Imperial Army, or as it was known back then, the Imperialis Auxilia, was born. Originally they were just a garrison force, but as time went on, millions grew into billions of troops, and those billions into massive armadas, all equipped with starships and sent up to mop up the resistance after the Space Marine legions broke the enemy's back. Eventually, they would be fighting right alongside the legendary Astartes and even the Primarchs on the front lines of war. And then everything went sideways, as the War Master Horus Lupercal betrayed the Emperor and triggered the Horus Heresy, a cataclysmic civil war that ripped apart the galaxy in twine. And when the dust settled, technically the Loyalists did win, but it was a Pyrrhic victory, as the leaders of the Imperium were left to look around and realize the massive problem they had. The Imperial Army was too powerful, as that had been one of the main tools the War Master had used to break the backs of humanity. And if another rebellion happened, entire fleets of warships and billions upon billions of ground troops could turn on them all at once. So, out of sheer paranoia and a desperate need for self-preservation, they split the military in half. The space-faring fleets became the Imperial Navy, and the ground forces would become the Astra Militarum we know today. Having them separate guaranteed that at no one point could either of them wage a war without the other's backing. And by separating this, it ensured an effective but crippling power balance would exist. If a planetary regiment goes rogue, they would have no ships to leave their planet and spread their treachery, and it would only require a Space Marine detachment to eliminate them. If a Navy fleet mutinies, they would have no access to sufficient ground troops to be effective in any way, shape, or form. They'd be unable to take and hold territory, and they'd have no lines of resupply. This was a powerful lesson learned in the darkest days of humanity, that combined arms tactics, while unbelievably effective, did leave the window open for mutiny and traitors to exploit our own resources. And it all set the stage for the brutal wars that would go on in the 41st millennium. So now that we've talked about the sheer mind-numbing scale of the Astra Militarum and how the Imperial Army was functionally cut in half after the Horus Heresy, in order to prevent the military from ever having the combined arms ability to overthrow the entirety of the Imperium again, with the ships going to the Navy and the ground troops going into the Imperial Army proper, we have to move forward to understand what it means to be a guardsman. And to do so, we have to look at the absolute isolation and the horrific reality of how this universe actually functions. The Imperium of Man is vast, unbelievably so. We are talking about a scale that is genuinely incomprehensible to the human mind. But it isn't a connected, happy empire. It's millions of isolated points of light surrounded by total gnawing darkness attempting to consume them. To commute or travel between these worlds, humanity has to rely on the warp. And it is where things get truly unsettling. The warp isn't just hyperspace, it's an alternate dimension of pure chaotic energy filled with entities that actively hate you and wish to destroy, devour, and consume you. Plunging into the warp in order to travel means risking your very soul, temporal displacement, and or instantaneous corruption. Because the Imperium's central command is constantly fighting against the unpredictable nightmare that is the warp, organizing a unified galactic strategy is functionally impossible to an incredible degree, and only under the most grueling of circumstances has it ever been possible. Warfare in the 41st millennium, therefore, becomes a matter of soulless, grinding logistics. On every single border is humanity's worst nightmares, constantly pressing inwards. And the only thing keeping them back is the Astra Militarum, as they fight a punishing, horrific series of constant and never-ending battles of attrition. When an enemy aircraft moves with impossible alien grace, guardsmen don't try to outfly them. They just fill the sky with a thunderstorm of munitions until there is nowhere left to dodge. When they fight eldritch dark sciences that they cannot comprehend, and they will never be able to understand, the glorious Imperial Guard just meet it with an overwhelming apocalyptic amount of artillery fire, alongside the gallant charge of hundreds upon hundreds of battle tanks. As the lore perfectly puts it, all that alien deviance comes to absolutely nothing in the face of human intolerance backed by a sufficient number of guns. But for all those tanks and all that artillery, the true backbone of the Guard is its infantry. This is where the tragedy of 40k really hits home within this faction. The sheer scale of these wars is truly and aggressively dehumanizing. To the high-ranking Imperial strategos looking at their scroll screens deep in orbit, entire regiments of brave men and women by necessity have to be reduced to mere statistics, since the numbers you are dealing with and the amount of lives you are actively juggling are just grains of sand slipping through your fingers. Even for these privileged commanders, the pressure of trillions upon trillions of lives being lost due to a rounding error is soul-crushing. Yet down in the mud, every single one of those individuals matters. Without a constant, unending deluge of new recruits, the Imperium will fall apart. You can have millions of troops deployed in a single war zone, but time and time again, the fate of an entire world will come down to a single desperate squad, its handful of men and women terrified beyond all measures, bleeding and giving their lives in order to hold a vital gatehouse against the literal hellspawn so their betters can evacuate and humanity can last for another day, another hour, another second. These aren't super soldiers. They do not have magic armor, and they most definitely know exactly how outmatched they truly are, which means they are perpetually terrified. But they lift their lasguns regardless and plant their feet in the ground as they charge, kicking and screaming into the mouths of Cerberus itself. Their lives are brutally short, but their sacrifices are incomprehensible despite them truly being thankless, since they are the true reason why humanity survives to see tomorrow. To understand how humanity became this desperate and militant, we have to actually go back once again, but this time even further than the Great Crusade. We have to go back to Terra, or our Earth, during the horrific period known as the Age of Strife. This was a time when humanity was completely cut off from the rest of the galaxy due to massive warp storms thanks to the Eldar's lack of self-control, as they were birthing She Who Thirsts. All the high sciences and the wondrous technology of our glorious past would be completely gone. What was left was a battered, post-apocalyptic wasteland ruled by techno-barbarian warlords. These warlords spend thousands of years fighting endless wars of attrition over the ruins of Earth, casually using chemical, biological, and thermonuclear weapons on each other. It was in this cradle of absolute misery and oppression that the Astra Militarum, or at least its first concepts, would be born. This is a horrific backdrop where the Emperor of Mankind finally revealed himself. Before he had made the Space Marines, before he had conquered the stars, he had to conquer and rule his own planet. And to do this, he created the Genos, genetically engineered warriors that were the rough prototypes of what would become the Thunder Warriors and eventually the Space Marines. These early Strife Epoch regiments were formed in the absolute worst forms of fighting imaginable. During the Unification Wars, they became the original nucleus of the Imperial Army, and from the very beginning, humanity's defense was born in the fires of a post-apocalyptic wasteland, setting the grim tone and standard that the Astra Militarum carries forward upon the galaxy even to this day. Now, if we look back to the glorious centuries of the Great Crusade, things definitely look a little bit different. The Emperor of Mankind was personally at the forefront of galactic expansion until he made the mistake of trusting Horus. And at the very forefront of this expansion, he was flanked by his demigod sons, the Primarch, alongside their Space Marine legions. But the eerie reality of conquering a galaxy is that space is just too vast for a limited number of super soldiers, despite how super they may be. Even the all-conquering Adeptus Astartes will eventually be spread too thin. Rather than leaving the newly conquered worlds unguarded, the Emperor mandated the creation proper of the Imperial Army. At first, it was just a ragtag collection of local volunteers, mercenaries, and pacified indigenous warriors, and they would act almost exclusively as peacekeeping forces. But as the crusade pushed further and further out into the edges of the known galaxy, the demands of war skyrocketed, and as follows, the administrators of this early imperium calculated a brutal tithe. This was a tax paid not in currency, but in human lives and war material. Sparsely populated worlds might only give a few regiments a year, but the claustrophobic, overcrowded hive worlds, which were near the galactic core, would churn out hundreds of regiments every single year. By the time humanity reached the eastern fringe, the Imperium's army wasn't just a garrison force anymore. They were a massive, autonomous, frontline conquering unit with their own interstellar fleets backing them up, fully capable of single-handedly wiping out advanced civilizations. Unfortunately, by that time, the unthinkable would come to happen. And during the Horus Heresy, where the War Master Horus, the favored son, betrayed the God Emperor, he didn't just take the legions, he took the mortal armies as well. Many of them uninformed and believing they were the ones truly betrayed by the Imperium. Millions upon millions of heavily armed men, women, and trained professionals, complete with their own vast armadas and endless columns of armor, were suddenly unleashed on the very empire they had just finished building. Imagine the absolute horror of that realization. Planets that had just embraced the enlightened truth of the Imperium were suddenly subjected to the apocalyptic orbital bombardments of their own protectors. Former comrades fought tooth and nail in the rubble of once perfect cities as the traitor armies tore down the monuments of reason and replaced them with grotesque heretical idols of ancient, malicious, cackling gods. This wasn't just a rebellion, it was what we would know it as forevermore, the galactic meat grinder. One where humanity was forced to look into a mirror and realize it was his own worst enemy. When the dust finally settled in the 31st millennium, the Emperor was interred upon the Golden Throne, and his loyal son, Rabu Guilliman, was left to pick up the pieces. Guilliman took a look at the smoldering ruins of the galaxy and realized giving a single human commander control over both ground and space fleets was a recipe for potential extinction. So, through a great treatise known as De Tactica Imperium, the military was brutally fractured in two steps. First came the severing, as the Imperial Army would cease to exist, and the void-faring fleets became the Imperial Navy. Then the ground pounders would be made into the Astra Militarum. Never again would the two operate under a single unified command structure, without extensive bureaucratic oversight. Then would be the formation of the Watchdogs. To enforce the paranoid reality of humanity's experiences, the Officio Perfecticus was born. These are the commissars, men and women who indoctrinate the youth to be incorruptible. They are terrifying arbiters of imperial law, ready to publicly execute cowards or malcontents at a drop of a hat. Trust and tactical flexibility were completely sacrificed on the altar of internal security. If a planetary regiment rebelled now, they were functionally stranded. If a fleet turned traitor, they had no ground troops to secure a beachhead. With the belief that treason was inevitable, from now on, it would be forced to be isolated, fragmented, and violently crushed. When the people forget their duty, they are no longer human and become something less than beasts. They have no place in the bosom of humanity, nor in the heart of the Emperor. Let them die and be forgotten. Prime Edict of the Holy Synod of the Adeptus Ministorum. Since that catastrophic schism, the Astra Militarum has fought for 10,000 years. Over time, actual history has dissolved into myth, but deep in the suffocating archives of the Departamento Ministorum, you might find dust-covered tapestries or faded frescoes hinting at the truth of those ancient days. However, for the average guardsman, all they have is those legends. They tell stories of the supposed fictitious burlesque companies and the selfless sacrifice of Olanius Pius, a mortal who supposedly stood between a literal god and certain death. To keep this unfathomably large and culturally divided army together, the Imperial Army relies upon two things: fanaticism and machinery. Zealous priests of the Adeptus Ministorum march alongside their troops, using the brutal dogma of the Imperial Creed to unify soldiers from vastly different worlds. Meanwhile, the tech priests of the machine god move silently through the trenches, soothing the machine spirits of the heavy artillery and tanks required to keep the darkness at bay. To list every war the Guard has fought would actually take hundreds of lifetimes, but a few conflicts truly define the brutality of their legacy. These would include the Great Scouring. In the aftermath of the heresy, the Guard waged a brutal, retributive campaign, driving the surviving terrors into the nightmarish anomaly known as the Eye of Terror. This led to the militarization of Cadia, turning the entire solar system into the galaxy's most vital fortress. There's also the Age of Apostasy. During the 36th millennium, a tyrant known as Goj seized control of both the bureaucracy and the church. The Guard, unfortunately, was caught in the middle, with some regiments acting as his violent enforcers, while the loyalists rallied behind the preacher known as Sebastian Thor and worked to tear the despot down. There was the Macarian Crusade, where Lord Commander Solar Macarius led a legendary, almost mythical push into the Segmentum Pacificus, conquering thousands of new worlds and pushing the borders of humanity further than anyone had in millennia. And then there was the Era of Annihilation, from the twin orc incursions that ravaged the hive world of Armageddon, to the grinding attrition against the Tau in the Damocles Gulf, alongside the galactic scale apocalyptic defense of Ultramar against the Tyrannid swarms. The Guard would pay for every inch of these victories in oceans upon oceans of blood. But none of these horrors could truly prepare them for what was coming, because despite all the omens, despite the countless of billions sacrificed, no one was truly ready for the fall of Cadia and the sky itself tearing open. As the galaxy was ripped asunder, for 10,000 years, the fortress world of Cadia stood and was the ultimate shield for humanity, as it sat straight on the edge of the Eye of Terror, which is a massive bleeding tear into reality where the warp oozes into real space. Cadia was the lock on the gate, and the Cadian shock troopers were the ones holding that key. Their entire culture, the world's entire populace, and their existence was built around the stoic duty of guarding against horrifying odds. To the rest of the Imperial Guard, Cadia wasn't just a stronghold, it was a symbol of human inavoidability. If Cadia held, humanity would hold. Then came Abaddon the Despoiler, and his tantrum known as the 13th Black Crusade. This wasn't just another raid. Abaddon unleashed the forces of chaos on a scale not seen since the Horus Heresy, 10 millennia prior. But the Astra Militarum did what they do best. They dug in and endured thunderous orbital bombardments, massive tank duels straight through the shattered outskirts of their fortress cities, alongside the relentless, unending waves of demonic horrors. Leading this impossible defense was Lord Castellan Ulsakar Creed, a man who became a legend simply by being brilliant. He was an unyielding human tactician staring down immortal nightmares. As his forces held the line, he sent desperate, ceaseless astropathic calls into the void, pulling countless regiments of Space Marines, Sisters of Battle, and other Guard regiments to hold the line. And for a moment, against all odds and reasons, it looked like it might actually be enough. The rallying cry of Cadia stands echoed across the trenches. But when Abaddon realized he couldn't break the Cadians on the ground, he did something truly horrific and potentially idiotic. He took the Will of Eternity, one of his last black stone fortresses, which were colossal, ancient technology that far surpassed at points even the Necron, and he dropped it from orbit directly onto the planet. Imagine you're one of these few defenders of Cadia who is still standing by this point, and seeing an alien space station the size of a continent plummeting through the atmosphere like a burning comet. And then it hit, cracking the world open, as firestorms and tsunamis, alongside world-ending earthquakes, ripped the surface apart, leading to the alien pylons that held the warp back, shattering. This caused the Eye of Terror to greedily swallow up the planet, turning the surface into a playground for literal demons. Out of nearly 1 billion souls who stood defending Cadia, barely 3 million were evacuated. Creed, however, stayed behind, leading a doomed rearguard action so others could escape. Now, unbeknownst to most of the galaxy, he would later be collected by Trazyn the Infinite. So now Cadia was gone, their greatest leader, while the heroes of humanity was also functionally gone, but the community of Cadians would famously state the planet broke before the Guard did, because even during the final moments of Cadia being sundered into ash, regiments of Astra Militarum were fighting on the world tooth and nail to at least bite their thumb at the forces who had stolen their world from them. With the fall of Cadia, the warp surged forth, tearing the galaxy completely in half. This was the birth of the Cicatrix Maledictum, or the Great Rift. This is where the sheer existential horror of this setting truly sets in. When the rift opened, it unleashed a violent tidal wave of psychic energy that battered Imperial forces into oblivion. If you were a newly raised regiment on a transport ship or an industrial world preparing supplies, there was a very real chance that you were just swallowed up by the warp at that instant. Worse still, the psychic shockwave completely blotted out the Astronomicon, also known as the Emperor's Lighthouse, which allows humanity to navigate the stars. This period of time became known as the Noctis Athena, the endless night, leaving millions upon millions stranded, completely blind, while the fabric of reality outside their ships started boiling with demonic forces. Half the galaxy is now known as the Imperium Nihilus under the command of Lord Commander Dante, all the while the Knight of Nihilus, Lionel Johnson, stalks its depths. And this half of the galaxy was left in total darkness. Even with the re-establishment of the Astronomicon, the light refuses to pierce the veil of Nihilus. Now, in the Era Indomitus, when the light of the Astronomicon finally flared back to life, it illuminated a ravaged, bleeding Imperium. But humanity's response wasn't the whimper of a dying animal like those Eldar, but rather it was a roar of a titan. The Era Indomitus, with the Primarch Reboot Guilliman being newly awakened and acting as Imperial Regent, looked upon the apocalypse and did what humanity does best, declared a new crusade. This would be known as the Indomitus Crusade, and it was a mobilization of forces arguably greater in mass than that of the Great Crusade itself. But it wasn't a clean, heroic salvation. For the Astra Militarum, the dark times were just ramping up. Warzone commanders were screaming for logistical support that didn't exist. To feed Guilliman's massive fleets, the Imperium's bureaucracy would have to bleed worlds dry. Conscription drives literally emptied out entire hive cities of their populations. Industrial worlds were pushed past the point of collapse in order to produce enough lasguns, tanks, and other equipment. If a planet survived demonic incursion, their reward was having the remaining population drafted into the fight to save the next burning world. While Guilliman's massive fleet pushed back the dark, they were only a fraction of the war. Thousands of subsectors off the path of the main crusade meant the Imperial Guard had massive swaths of space to fight in alone, meaning that they would redeploy constantly throughout storm-tossed warp channels, fighting orcs in the Octarius sector, Necrons in the Ingenious cluster, and putting down massive gene-stealer cult uprisings on their own homeworlds. The pressure on the High Command was truly unimaginable. Arcadian Leontus, Lord Commander Solar, tasked with protecting Terra itself, is now essentially fighting a galactic siege. He is dealing with the heretics from without and the traitors from within, all the while trying to marshal forces to the galactic east to stop the Tyranids, which are an extragalactic swarm of biological horrors who had launched the Fourth Tyrannic War while humanity was bleeding out from the chaos incursion that occurred not too long ago. Through all this, the Astra Militarum remains exactly what it has always been. They are not demigods. They do not have impenetrable armor. They are terrified, exhausted, normal men and women standing in the mud of 1,000 ruined worlds, and yet against demons, vile aliens, and the literal tearing of reality itself. They lift their lasguns, they plant their feet, and they hold the line. Because if they don't, humanity dies. There is a very specific, chilling calculus to human life in the 41st millennium, since you don't just magically summon up an army that stretches out across the stars. You have to build it, manage it, and most importantly, feed it. And to understand how the Imperium does that, we have to look at the massive, bloated hierarchy of the Imperial Guard. When you look down to the organizational level, the Astra Militarum is divided into countless sub-factions, all managed by the Departamento Munitorum. It's a labyrinth of endless divisions. You have the Munitorum Regimentus, the people who manage the actual front lines of infantry and armored regiments, the Militarum Tempestus, the divisions holding the elite, highly trained Tempestus Scions, the Militarum Auxilia, the branch responsible for maintaining abhumans like Ogrins, Ratlins, and the Imperium's catgirls, known as the Philinids, alongside other auxiliary forces. Alongside them, you have the Militarum Strategus and the Departmental Tacticae. The general staff, these are the officers trained in the esoteric arts of commanding from the rear, moving millions of troops on the map from the safety of an orbiting ship or a fortified bunker, all the while having the weight of their lives bearing down upon their backs. And constantly watching over them is the Officio Perfecticus, also known as the Commissariat. They are the political officers standing behind the front lines, ready to execute anyone who steps out of line or questions orders. But the real question is, where do all these soldiers come from? As every single planetary governor in the Imperium is legally obliged to maintain their own local military known as a planetary defense force, the Imperium leaves those governors mostly alone to rule how they see fit, as long as they pay their taxes. But in the grim darkness of the far future, taxes aren't just paid in resources, they're paid in blood. These taxes are known as the Imperial Tithe. Every year, a governor is required to hand over at least 10% of their entire military force to the Astra Militarum, and because the penalty for providing substandard tithes is the summary execution of the governor, the troops they send to the stars are usually the absolute elite of their planet. The scale of the tithe is entirely dependent on the world, however. Take a heavily populated hive world like Armageddon. A standard tithe for them might see a draft of 100 million soldiers and several million armored vehicles. And the most eerie part of it all is, for a hive world, 100 million people is barely a rounding error on their population, as it is just a tiny fraction of the numbers they produce a day, as an average hive world will have hundreds upon hundreds of billions of souls living on it. Compare that to the far-flung agri-worlds, also known as farming planets. Their tithes might only see 5 million cavalry and infantry, but to them it could represent a massively crippling chunk of their already diminished population. Because the Imperium is so vast and disconnected, the actual method for recruiting these troops varies wildly, and it paints a grim picture of the universe. On brutal death worlds like Katachan, where the local wildlife actively tries to eat you the second you are born, every single man, woman, and child is already essentially a soldier. Surviving in the jungle fighter's regiment isn't a draft, it's just growing up. On the seething claustrophobic hive worlds like Aklatron, the local authorities just round up indentured undercity gangs and give them a simple choice: put on the uniform, serve in the guard, or be executed on the street. The choice then is rather easy. But perhaps the saddest reality is on the smog-choked industrial worlds. Here, factory workers live short and miserable lives. They never see the sky, as they work on endless shifts until they drop dead. For them, joining the Imperial Guard is seen as a privilege. Young hopefuls literally flock upon the recruiting stations the day they are eligible to, begging to be sent into the horrific war zones of the galaxy because it's the only possible escape from their crushing subterranean existence. And on some savage frontier worlds, the competition to join the Guard is so fierce that it escalates into life and death conflict that will often claim as many lives as a small war would. Once you are drafted, you are loaded onto an Imperial Navy transport, and for a lot of the recruits, their only official Astra Militarum training happens in the dark, cramped cargo bays of these ships during their long, terrifying journey through the warp to whatever war zone they're being thrown into. A fading memory of home is considered one of the average guardsman's most constant companions. When you are drafted into the Imperial Guard, you accept the cold, harsh truth. 99.999% of you are never going home. You will be shipped across the galaxy, fighting in endless war zones for years, or even decades. But there is a single glimmering hope for a guardsman: the concept known as the right of settlement. If a regiment manages to survive a particularly brutal, costly campaign, and they are the only semblance of imperial order left on the world they just saved, the Imperium gives them the right to the planet as a reward for their service. They are granted what is known as custodianship. The surviving officers become the new wealthy nobles, and the surviving enlisted troops become the elite ruling class. In the grim darkness of the far future, The absolute best retirement you can hope for is inheriting a blood-soaked, radioactive, ash-choked world you just spent the last 5 years destroying and crushing the filthy blue Xenos on. And yet, despite all this, despite the 10% tithes, the gang drafts, and the volunteers, it still isn't enough. Modern lore, especially after the opening of the Great Rift, tells us that the Imperium is facing a critical, existential manpower shortage. The bureaucracy of the tithe is starting to break down under the weight of these endless wars, and the overworked general staff is resorting to mass conscription on a truly terrifying scale. We're talking about literally emptying out hive cities, handing billions of terrified, untrained civilians a lasgun, and shoving them off into ships. These aren't the elite PDF forces anymore. They are hastily assembled conscripts with only the barest of minimum training and equipment, thrown directly into the jaws of Cerberus in order to clog the gears of the enemy's war machine with their bodies long enough for the real warriors to arrive. It is a desperate, white-knuckled fight for survival, managed by a bureaucracy that views human lives as nothing more than an ink ledger, not due to inherent callousness, but due to the necessity of the scale of warfare they face. At the absolute top of this unfathomable military machine sits the Departmental Ministorum. These are the folks who manage the logistics, the supplies, and the overarching strategy for the Imperial Guard. And they do so wielding so much power that they actually hold 3 separate seats on the Council of the High Lords of Terra. But they don't micromanage every single war. Instead, they operate on devolved, tried threat systems. And here's how it works. If a planet is attacked, the local planetary defense force has to handle it. If the threat is big, a distress signal gets bumped up to the subsector level, and nearby worlds will be mobilized. If things get truly apocalyptic, it goes to the sector level, dragging hundreds of worlds into a massive war of attrition. But here's where things get a little sticky. The Imperium is so vast and its bureaucracy so bloated and archaic that this process is notoriously and agonizingly slow. So as a soldier in a trench watches the world burn, and you finally manage to send a message to the Monitorum, that message might not be acted upon for months, years, or even decades. It's a terrifyingly common occurrence due to the massive size of the Imperium itself, for an ungodly huge relief fleet to arrive at a coordinate, ready for a war, only to find that the planet they were sent to save has been a dead radioactive cinder for hundreds of years. If you do get saved, the army that arrives is usually a bizarre conglomeration of regiments from dozens of different worlds, thrown together into a grueling war of attrition until the enemy is simply ground down to dust. Now, what does one of these armies actually look like, one might ask? The primary building block for the Astra Militarum is the regiment. Every time a planet pays the imperial tithe, those troops are formed into a brand new, self-contained force. The size of this force can vary wildly. A standard infantry regiment might consist of tens of thousands of units, or even hundreds of thousands of people. But if you're looking at something highly specialized, like the Vestorian Armored 24th, it might be just 1,500 guys crewing a dozen massive super heavy tanks. The structure itself is pretty standard. Regiments can be broken down into companies, anywhere from 3 to 20, which are broken down into platoons, and then finally divided into 10-man infantry squads. But there's a very specific paranoid rule that applies to every single regiment. No matter where they come from, the commissars assigned to them are always outsiders. The Imperium deliberately assigns off-world political officers to watch the troops, ensuring that these enforcers have zero cultural ties or personal sympathies with the men and women they have to execute for cowardice. Now we need to talk about reinforcements, or rather the complete lack thereof, because on an Astra Militarum regimental scale, the regiment itself is a temporary disposable asset. Once the regiment leaves the homeworld, it almost never receives new recruits back from home. They are simply too expensive, and getting replacements from halfway across the galaxy is rare. But it does happen, such as for the Vestorian Firstborn, but are potentially possible for some units with more standardized military cultures, such as the Cadians or the Kriegsmen. So what happens when a regiment goes from 100,000 and is whittled down to 10,000? The Departmental Ministorum just starts gluing broken down regiments together. If you're lucky, you merge with another depleted unit from your home planet, but often you can get things called mongrel units. You take survivors from a desert world and mash them together with survivors from an ice world, then tell them to figure out how to fight together. But there's another, much darker way regiment reinforces their numbers. If a regiment survives enough out in the void, since they are not gender segregated units, children will often be born to the soldiers. These kids are raised entirely inside the baggage train of these regiments, and they never know their homeworld or a normal life. Then, when they reach the required age, they are assigned officially as probits of the regiment, but everyone in reality calls them white shields. They are often thrown directly into their own specialized platoons, where their final combat training consists of being shot into an actual war zone. If they survive, they get to be guardsmen proper. If they die, well, no harm, their parents can just make more. Eventually, every guard regiment meets one of three fates. First, and most overwhelmingly common, is that they are simply destroyed in battle, then erased from the ledger. Second is an endless cycle of amalgamation, being merged with other broken units until you die fighting someone else's war. But the third fate is the closest thing to a happy ending that you'll get in a galaxy where there is no time for peace, only war. If a regiment is so badly mauled that they aren't even worth merging, but they manage to win a campaign, they might be left behind as a garrison. The local defense forces are always wiped out by the time a garrison actually makes it to the world to defend, and the surviving guardsmen are the only semblance of imperial law left. As a reward for their unimaginable suffering, they are granted the right of settlement. They get to take off their armor and stay back on this planet and form a brand new noble ruling class, meaning that they get to spend the rest of their lives ruling over the burnt, shattered husk of a world they just finished destroying. And in the grim darkness of the far future, other than being a psychopathic hero like Commissar Yarrick, it's as good as you get. Now, to understand how, despite these mass numbers, humanity isn't just winning every fight they go into, you have to remember that in the Imperium of Man, technology isn't a science, it's a religion. The Adeptus Mechanicus, the cyborg priesthood of Mars, controls all machinery, and they view new technological innovation as literal heresy, where even the slightest alteration to a gun's firing mechanism or a tank tread can invite a death sentence. Because this paranoid superstition is so prevalent, the Imperial Guard is fighting a galactic war using weapons and vehicles that are literally ancient. The Lehman Ross battle tank, for example, whose design is barely younger than the Imperium itself, has been in service for 10 millennia. But there is a beautiful, brutal genius to the stagnation. The weapons and vehicles of the Guard, like the troop-carrying Chimera, are essentially the AK-47 of the cosmos. They are fuel-fed, highly reliable, and absurdly simple to manufacture, meaning that they will work in almost any environment. Even the most ubiquitous weapon in humanity's arsenal is ancient. This is a venerable lasgun. It's so cheap and easy to produce, it is made on a million different forge worlds and is endlessly reliable. Depending on where a regiment comes from, the lasgun might be held by a soldier in high-tech battle dress, or it might be held by a feudal barbarian wearing little more than primitive tribal tattoos and a loincloth. The only universal piece of equipment every guardsman shares is their service identity tag, stamped with their name, rank, and a massive Munitorum serial number. These tags are treated by the soldiers as not just identification, but as holy icons, the only tangible proof they lived, fought, and died for the God Emperor. When you have a military that draws 10% tithe from millions of worlds upon thousands of light years, your greatest resources isn't technologies or tactics, it's bodies, ceaseless waves of them. The military doctrine of the Astra Militarum is a total grinding warfare of attrition. If a Space Marine chapter sends 100 super soldiers to surgically achieve an objective, the Imperial Guard sends hundreds of thousands of regular people to overwhelm them with sheer numbers. It genuinely does not matter how many casualties it takes. The Imperial Guard will drown the enemy in bodies if that is what it takes to secure a hill. But there is a secondary and deeply paranoid layer to how the Guard operates. When the Department of Moonstorm forms armies, they are intentionally designed to be heavily specialized. You have a light infantry regiment with absolute zero mobilized transport support or heavy troops. Somewhere else you'll have an artillery regiment with massive world-leveling guns, but absolutely nothing to protect them. This isn't by accident. It's a desperate structural safeguard. By making sure no singular regiment is a complete self-sustaining army, the Imperium guarantees they have to rely on each other. If a general decides to rebel, his massive artillery regiment is going to get slaughtered the second the enemy gets close enough because they don't have infantry to hold the line. It ensures that the only way the Guard works is when a massive conglomerate of totally different cultures and bioscreened techno-troopers are rubbing shoulders with underhive gangers side by side. And because the galaxy is so impossibly large, this means that there is no master list of all regiments. In fact, due to bureaucratic errors, there are entire armies currently fighting crusades that the entirety of the Administratum has completely forgotten about. They are ghosts in the machine, fighting for an empire who doesn't even know they exist, but constantly somehow getting resupplied. But out of the sea of endless humanity, there are certain regiments that have become absolute legends. The Cadian Shock Troop, the gold standard for the Guard. Born and raised on the doorsteps of hell, their discipline and tactics copied by millions over trillions of worlds. There's the Death Corps of Krieg. Hailing from the radioactive post-apocalyptic wasteland, these soldiers view their own lives as currency to be spent in the service of the Emperor, and they specialize in horrific World War I-style trench warfare and siege tactics. You also have the Catachan Jungle Fighters, raised on the Death World, where the local fauna and flora actively try to eat you. These are the galaxy's premier guerrilla fighters. Then you have the Valhallan Ice Warriors. Coming from a frozen, unforgiving planet, they are legends for how stubborn they are in their refusal to retreat, regardless of how unfathomable the odds are, throwing wave after wave of infantry into the absolute worst conditions imaginable. And then you have my personal favorite, the lesser-known forces such as the Savlar Chem Dogs, regiments of thieves and cutthroats who fight purely for the promise of stealing anything that isn't bolted down after the battle happens. They have been known to even steal enemy tanks and entire super heavy contingents after a battle. And you have the less fun, but still legendary, 13th Penal Legion, consisting of condemned criminals fitted with explosive collars and sent on self-terminating missions to earn a pardon that they will almost certainly never see. This is how the Astra Militarum, the deeply superstitious, technologically stagnant meat grinder, throws millions of different cultures into the dark every day. They are a terrified group of outnumbered exiles, conscripts, and completely expendable individuals. But they are willing to stand shoulder to shoulder in the mud, holding the line against the end of the universe in order to keep humanity alive. Now, to further understand things, we have to look at the span of tens of thousands of years, because every single hero immortalized on a marble statue in this universe, for every single one of them, there's a million regular people who died completely unadorned in the mud. And to understand how the Guard got to be the way it is, we have to look at the history of humanity and how it tried to rebuild after its greatest betrayal. After the Horus Heresy, the Imperium entered what was known as the Age of Rebirth. The galaxy was essentially a smoldering ruin, and the leadership on Terra was terrified. This was when they implemented the doctrines like the Tactica Imperium, physically dividing the Imperial Army and the Navy into the Astra Militarum and the Imperial Navy proper. Under no regards would a single commander ever threaten the galaxy again. During this time, they launched the Great Scouring, a massive campaign of vengeance where they drove the surviving traitors and their forces into the nightmarish realm known as the Eye of Terror. To make sure they stayed there, humanity started bolstering on a nearby planet called Cadia, turning it into an anchor point for a fortress second only in defensive capabilities to Terra itself. And it's a good thing they did, because shortly after, Abaddon the Despoiler launched his very first Black Crusade. He hit Cadia with everything he had, and the Cadian Shock Troopers, fighting alongside Space Marines, managed to hurl him back armless into the void. Then we have to move into the foregoing, a period where humanity actually started to bounce back. The Imperium expanded aggressively, reclaiming lost star systems and unearthing ancient technologies that slowed their decline and pushed their civilization decades upon centuries forward. Because Cadia had proven itself against Abaddon, the Cadian shock troopers were basically given the job of becoming the galaxy's drill sergeants, and they travelized to newly colonized worlds, imparting their brutal battle discipline and military doctrine onto countless of local defense forces. This meant that across the stars, the Astra Militarum was molding itself into the image of Cadia, and they would need this discipline because, eventually, Abaddon would implement his third Black Crusade, where Abaddon threw a massive demonic horde at the Cadian Gate, which meant millions of guardsmen would have to die in order to refuse him even an inch of dirt, buying enough time for reinforcements to arrive and push the nightmare back into the void once more. But this era also gave us the most unsettling and eerie stories in all of 40k, and it perfectly highlights the creeping paranoia of the Imperium's leadership. There was a man named Admiral Usrus, who decided he didn't care about the rules. He formed a massive combined military bloc, taking control of his Imperial fleet directly against Astra Militarum requirements. He essentially rebuilt the pre-heresy military structure, and the High Lords of Terra were terrified of his power because of this. They knew assassinating him would spark a massive civil war, so they did something far more sinister. They congratulated him, told him he was a hero, and sent him to an expeditionary mission deep into the uncharted intergalactic Gulf. For 20 years, Ursus sent back reports of conquering new systems, and the glory of the Imperium was then spread. And for 20 years, Terra just read the messages and never replied. When the messages finally stopped, no one ever went looking for him. They just let him vanish back into the dark. Things only got darker as the timeline shifted into the Age of Apostasy. This was a period where, for whatever reason the Imperium had left was completely eclipsed by religious zealotry that is even more extreme than that of today. There, a man named Goj Vandar took control of the bureaucracy and sparked a horrific 7-decade-long civil war known as Reign of Blood. He used the Astra Militarum as his personal enforcers, wiping out entire planetary populations in order to enforce his cruel, misbegotten tyranny. And it wasn't until a loyalist regiment worked alongside Space Marines who rallied behind, known as Sebastian Thor, that Goj Vandar was finally stopped. But the paranoia didn't end there. In the aftermath, the High Lords of Terra initiated something known as the Great Cull. They went through entire Imperial command structures and strategically purged them. Commanders of the Astra Militarum who were ever suspended or suspected of disloyalty were publicly burned or quietly assassinated in the night. To prove their faith, the Imperium launched the Redemption Crusades, a rapid, violent outpouring of military forces to re-establish control. But in their frenzy to prove their loyalty, they threw so many regiments into a grueling deep space campaign that it left countless worlds completely undefended. And by the time the absolute madness quelled, there were armies like the Tallarn Desert Raiders who became legendary by simply surviving the sheer logistical nightmares trying to fix a galaxy broken by bureaucracy. The next important period of time for the Imperium was the Wasting. Here's where things truly stopped looking like a grand, sweeping sci-fi epic and started looking like a slow-motion administrative car crash. For centuries, the armies of the Imperium were stretched so thin they were practically translucent. Xenos invasion, internal chaos, religious insurgencies, and all manner of horrible nightmares were popping up faster than the Departmental Ministorum could write memos about them. Take the Mordian Iron Guard, for instance. On their home system, things got violently unstable to the point they instituted a merciless absolute police state just to root out and eradicate 9 separate Zinchian chaos cults. And down on the mud, Abaddon the Despoiler just kept coming back, no matter how many times he had his forces annihilated. During his 9th Black Crusade, he descended upon the hive world of Antiasos, slaughtering the local defense forces before turning the entire conflict into a 17-year meat grinder where the planet was eventually pelted with orbital cyclonic torpedoes just to stop the bleeding. Every now and then, though, the Imperium would try to recapture the glory of the good old days. Enter Lord Commander Solar Macarius, a man who looked at the crumbling borders of the Imperium and decided to do something glorious about it. He mustered the largest Astra Militarum army the galaxy had ever seen since the days of the Great Crusade and blasted into the western fringes, conquering thousands of new worlds in what felt like a heartbeat. It was a legendary mythic campaign, but the moment Macarius died, the whole thing unraveled overnight. Those thousands of conquered new worlds immediately were plunged back into civil wars, proving once again that in the 41st millennium, building an empire is easy, but holding onto it is where you lose trillions of lives. And then we have the Gothic War, where the 12th Black Crusade pitted massive tides of gargantuan trader fleets against humanity's best and brightest. And here is when you get moments of pure, unfiltered desperation, like when the Elysian 234th performed a boarding action they knew they would never return from, just to ram and scuttle an enemy heavy cruiser, winning their commendations entirely posthumously, because not a single one of them survived. Or take the defense of Budahubs, where coronate cults threw themselves in frothing, maddening waves against Cadian lines, nearly breaking the Cadians before the Vestorian 45th arrived with Manticore and Death Strike missiles, in order to literally blow the entire battlefield away, and everyone on it too, to atoms. And then there's the final tally of lives lost in the First War for Armageddon, which was never truly disclosed, so it is obvious that it defies easy calculation. If you want the true, most chilling look at the Imperium and how it handles inconvenient history, this is a war to see, because this is when Demon Primarch Angron, a literal mountain of muscle, rage, and frothing, bubbling drool, descended upon a hive world in order to be at the head of a massive chaos host. The Astra Militarum and the Space Wolves held the line against all odds, and they won, banishing Angron back to the warp. But the real horror happened right after the battle was over, because the Inquisition decided that the knowledge of chaos shouldn't be spread, because it inherently corrupts those who survive it, especially when you were so close to losing to them. They instituted a cover-up so violently thorough that it would make your skin crawl just by reading about it. Massed regiments of guardsmen who fought on Armageddon were rounded up, sterilized, and dumped into permanent labor camps. Entire planets were functionally exterminated just to ensure the witnesses couldn't talk, or potentially spread chaos cults, which eventually they would regardless because they were left alive to some degree. And Segmentum Command? They were executed en masse by their own commissarial advisors, who voluntarily submitted themselves to the Inquisition for a complete mind wipe. They erased their own brains to keep their secrets and prevent the spread of the knowledge of chaos, still operating on the Emperor's mandate to erase all traces of chaos, no matter how grim. As we move closer to the end of the millennium, the losses just keep mounting, often without a single person outside the local subsector knowing. During the First Tyrannic War, High Fleet Behemoth slammed into Ultramar. The Ultramarines are rightfully hailed as heroes for stopping it, but history almost always forgets about the 47 regiments of Planetary Defense Forces and Ultramar Auxilia who stood shoulder to shoulder with them, as thousands of regular people stood in the path of biomechanical nightmares, firing lasguns and bolt pistols until their hands melted straight onto the triggers, purely to buy the Space Marines a few seconds of tactical advantage. Their sacrifices remain completely unsung and swallowed entirely by the shadow of the transhuman masters they served. There's also Operation Somnance, which occurred in 793 M41. This is one of the stories that feels straight out of a local ghost town legend. An inquisitor named Helvina Valeria requisitioned 5 full regiments of Catachan jungle fighters for a classified mission to a world known as Somnance. We know that Somnance was a Necron tomb world, a veritable nightmare of one therein. The Inquisitor returned from the mission a few months later, perfectly fine. However, not a single one of the guardsmen who went with her ever came back, and she also never filed a casualty report. No survivors would be debriefed, as they simply walked into a dead world with an Inquisitor and vanished from the census of the Imperium entirely. The names faded from their muster rolls, and their barracks reassigned, with the universe still turning, because in the Astra Militarum, you don't always die a glorious death in an explosion or las fire, and you don't go out selling your life to fire just a few more artillery shells. Sometimes you just venture out into the dark, deep dark of space with a pompous Inquisitor, and you disappear from records. However, if you want a masterclass in how the Imperium truly handles a problem, you can look at the Siege of Rax. It was an imperial world that fell to a renegade cardinal because the Munitorum, in their infinite wisdom, calculated that it would take 12 standard years to take it back. So they handed command to Lord General Zukel, a guy whose primary qualification was that his great-grandfather once brought coffee to a high-ranking official on Terra. The campaign didn't last 12 years, it took 17, and it wasn't a clean attrition that would normally have happened should procedure have been followed, but rather a brutal trench-clearing campaign of attrition using the death corpse of Krieg. When the dust finally settled, 14 million Imperial Guardsmen were dead, and every single person on the planet was either killed in the crossfire or executed for corruption. And what was the Imperium's reward for reclaiming this blood-soaked vault? A Lord Inquisitor looked at the planet and declared it Bendita, a dead world, and threw an interdiction cordon around the planet, locking it away in the dark so nobody could ever look at it again. A whole world turned into a locked mystery room wrapped in concrete. Sometimes the bureaucracy doesn't even wait for you to die. Take, for example, the Hammerant 4 Regiment. They were deployed to fight demons on the world called Phalanx, and they fought to the absolute last man, defending the civilian population until every single soldier was wiped out. But because the Departamento Munitorum's administrative backlog was so hopelessly backed up, no one noticed they were dead. A few months later, they were ordered to deploy to a new war zone. When the dead men failed to show up, the Departamento Munitorum officially cataloged them and charged the entire group with desertion, posthumously sentenced the entire regiment to death. In the Imperium, as a guardsman, you can't even get killed in action without the government finding a way to write up your entire group for truancy. On the world of Dulmina, a single regiment of Catachan jungle fighters, led by the legendary Colonel Stryken, fought a year-long underground war against the orcs. Stryken literally dragged an orc warlord into the path of a stampeding alien beast before getting blown up himself. But when Imperial reinforcements finally arrived, a haughty, useless officer named High Praetor Osherprine swooped in and took 100% of the credit himself, leading him to be awarded governorship of the planet. How did that work out for him? Well, he let a Slaneshi cult rise up shortly thereafter. And due to a mysterious series of communication failures from the Catachans, Oshrin Preen and his corrupt governance were left entirely alone to face their fate. Karma in the 41st millennium is rather brutal, but it is just as cunning as it is brutal. Meanwhile, on the industrial world of Armageddon, the galaxy was dealing with the biggest greenskin problem this side of Ulnor, Gazgul Mag Uruk Taraka. This massive orc warlord launched a series of apocalyptic invasions that forced the Imperium into a titanic war of attrition. It also gave us the iconic pairing of Commissar Yarrick and Gazgul, whom have had a battle of wits, and through sheer stubborn spite, Yarrick, armed with the cybernetic eye and a power claw ripped from an orc boss, held the line at Hades' Hive, with no small amount of assistance from Dante, Gabriel Seth, Thushan, and a few other Space Marines working in tandem with the Guard. But all of these wars, every single drop of blood spilled on Armageddon, Thrax, and thousands of other worlds, were just the opening act, because in 999 M41, Abaddon the Despoiler was preparing his 13th Black Crusade, and the signs that these were the end times were everywhere. In sectors bordering the Cadian system, dead space hulks drifted from the warp, carrying a terrifying zombie plague that turned planetary populations into walking nightmares. The mysterious Cadian pylons, those ancient obelisks holding back the warp, began to develop alarming hairline cracks, vibrating with the frequency of a dying scream. And then the rock came from the inside. At the Battle of Triok Fields, millions of guardsmen gathered for a general muster, and without warning, the Volscani Cataphracts, a regiment the Cadians trusted implicitly, opened fire upon them and their comrades. They quickly swarmed the vehicle of the Cadian government and wiped out the entirety of the High Command in a singular, brutal stroke. In this chaos, Usurak Creed stepped up, rallied the broken regiments, and dragged victory from the jaws of defeat and treason. For his brilliance, he was later named Lord Castellan of Cadia. However, when the final blow fell, it would blot out the stars, as Abaddon's armada descended upon the Cadian gate, turning the skies into a broiling ocean of fire and dropping millions of howling heretics onto the surface. For a brief, impossible moment, it looked like they might actually pull it off. As reinforcements arrived, Saint Celestine took to the skies, she ahead of the Adeptus Sororitas. All the while, Archmagos Belisarius Skull desperately tried to use the cracking pylons to anchor reality. Lord Castellan Creed held the line at Karskarft, screaming his defiant dictum, Cadia stands, even when Colonel Sergeant Jara Curl took a laser blast meant for Creed and died in the mud. The defenders refused to fall back. Then came the final crushing blow. Realizing he couldn't win, Abaddon took the legendary Will of Eternity, a black stone fortress, one of the last true ancient weapons Chaos had at its hand, and hurled it out of orbit, using it as an extinction-level meteor rather than using any debris or other space hulks as meteors. And when the ancient station slammed into the surface, it didn't just destroy a city, it shattered the tectonic plates of the planet and completely obliterated the Necron pylon network which was holding back the Imperium. At that moment, the warp would rush in like a starving predator, and the planet literally tore itself apart. Out of the nearly 1 billion souls fighting shoulder to shoulder in the trenches, barely 3 million made it off-world. Creed not being amongst them. However, the planet did break before the guard did, because on the remnants of the planet, until the last second, they were Cadians fighting against the dying of the light. Unfortunately, even in the indestructible fortresses such as Cadia, eventually the dark seems to swallow the light. Up until now, the Imperium has been a bloated bureaucratic nightmare, a terrifying machine, but at least it was connected. There was a rhythm to it. If you paid your tithe and sent your troops to the meat grinder, somewhere out there in the void, the Emperor's light guided your ships back home. But at the dawn of the 42nd millennium, in the era dryly called the Era Indomitus by scholars, that rhythm has been shattered, as the Great Rift has rolled out warp storms uncountable, and the guiding beacon of the Astronomican blinked out for a while, and when it returned, it only came back in half the galaxy, meaning that millions upon millions of Astra Militarum soldiers were out there in the void, without any hope for reinforcements, completely lost and flying blind. Entire fleets in transit were flung decades out of sync, or swallowed up completely by the dark. Half the galaxy, known as Imperium Nihilus, is still completely cut off and forced to fend for itself. Fortunately enough, the Primarch Rabut Guilliman entrusted this half of the Imperium to Dante, meaning that the guy mathematically older than him has to muster Imperial Guard regiments alongside his own Space Marine regiments in a place with little support, little backup, and no help from the Astronomicon. When you're out there in the dark, disconnected from everything you know, things start to get weird, eerie, the kinds of quiet dread that you only realize are there when nobody's coming to look for you. That's when things really go wrong. Take, for example, what happened to the Tallarn Desert Raiders during the Plague Wars. They were dispatched alongside the mysterious silver-armored Grey Knights to hunt down a horrific Nurgle-spawned plague that came from a drifting space hulk. Skirmishes flickered across dead moons and barren rocks. Grey Knights drilling the Desert Raiders on the one absolute terrifying rule: never close with the enemy and never leave your dead behind. They won. The rotting hordes wasted away, and the day was saved. To honor this sacrifice, the Grey Knights actually carved the name of the Tallarn Desert Raiders commander onto their armor. It sounds heroic, right? Awesome, they worked together. Unfortunately, these are the Grey Knights. And the moment the battle was over, the Grey Knights put every single Tallarn guardsman and officer to death. They executed them all on the spot to ensure the infectious plague spores wouldn't spread through the wider galaxy. One morning, their heroes, with their names carved into sacred armor, and by nightfall, their unmarked dead bodies ready to be burned. It's the chilling necessity of such conflicts that makes the life of the guardsmen such a nightmare. Back on the frozen world of Valhalla, things weren't much better. Fleeing refugees brought word of a massive greenskin fleet bearing down straight towards them. The Valhallan ice warriors jumped to intercept, but when they arrived at the staging world of Skavoy, they found a nightmare waiting for them. The planet's armories were completely empty. The resupply ships had been lost in the warp months ago. But did the glorious Valhallans panic? No. This is the Imperial Guard. Panicking requires energy, and they prefer to spend that energy shooting at things and blasting off again. Instead, they took what little they had left and looked at the local Scavonian civilian population. Then they prepared the population by handing them the tools to sharpen their knives and make spears, prepare rocks and catapults like the olden days of yore. Then they told these poor families and farmers to fall in line alongside the professional infantry and march straight into the oncoming roaring tides of orcs. When the greenskins charged, the frontline civilians were predictably shredded. But that was part of the grim math of it all. Hidden safely behind them, the Valhallan artillery regiments opened fire, raining chunks of high explosive ordnance right over their heads and their own makeshift lines, chewing through both human and alien flesh alike. The battlefield was silent by nightfall. It was brutal, it was pragmatic, and while it makes you question how much humanity is actually left on the planet to hold it, much of the remaining population on the world survived. And yet, despite the fact the galaxy is literally breaking in half, the spirit of the Guard refuses to stay down. Cadia as a planet may be gone, smashed to dust by Abaddon's vengeful meteor, but the Cadian shock troops scattered all across thousands of different war zones didn't miss a beat. They took their legendary discipline and started training local defense forces wherever they went, whispering that last defiant mantra Cadia stands over and over and over again. The surviving Cadians are now led by a new generation, Ursula J. Creed, the daughter of the legendary Lord Castellan, who inherited every single one of her father's gifts for tactical brilliance and stubborn determination. But even under new leadership, the reality of the Era Indomitus has a crushing weight, as despite the Cadians gaining a new Cadia, named creatively such, they continue to have to fight fleets arriving out of nowhere, virus bombing entire worlds into grey sterile rock. This is the reality of the Astra Militarum in the 41st millennium. They aren't genetically engineered super soldiers with glowing swords and golden armor. They are regular everyday people, farmers, hive gang members, factory workers, younglings from death worlds, handed a flashlight that overheats but tears through orcs and squishy blue aliens, then told to stand in front of horrors that defy human comprehension. They are often forgotten by the bureaucracy and erased by the Inquisition when they see too much, then fed by the millions into a galactic meat grinder that views them as merely ink on a ledger. But as long as the line holds, as long as someone is left to pull a trigger in the dark, humanity will keep on going. Because in the grim darkness of the far future, sometimes survival isn't about winning. Sometimes it's about being stubborn enough to make the darkness work for every single inch. Anyway, that's going to be it for today. If you enjoyed diving into this deeply unsettling rabbit hole, which is the bureaucratic nightmare of the 41st millennium, that is the Astra Militarum, leave a comment down below. And remember, sharing this video with a friend who needs a good existential crisis is a great way to help me in the algorithm. And subscribing will keep you from being left behind when I inevitably wander into the next deep dark corner of the 41st millennium. Until next time, stay safe, and if the Inquisition knocks at your door, just pretend you're not home.